So this is the first, I guess, assignment for the RPG Game Learning group, looking at this game, Nephilim, Occult Role-Playing. This is not my original copy. This is one I got here after I got the PDF online at DriveThruRPG. I found this used through an Amazon marketplace seller. It's in really good condition, not quite so good as my original, but anyway, I was lucky to get it, I feel. The game came out in 1994, a translation of a French game based in part on an obscure line in the Bible from Genesis, which says, in those times when men grew and multiplied after Adam had left Eden, the Nephilim roamed the earth. And while there's a lot of occult information out there online about what that reference means, the game gives us a different answer. And in this first installment, we're looking at basically Chapter 1 of Nephilim, the role-playing game. We get a little bit of in-game fiction posing as in-world documents. We have a brief overview of what it's going to be like to be a character on one page. We get the standard Chaosium, what is role-playing, although it's given its own unique treatment to address the specific type of role-playing you're going to be doing in Nephilim. And then we move into the meat of what this assignment was, the history of the Nephilim, which takes us up to page 18 in the text. Unique things about the role-playing section, the metric conversions, not commonly done. The unique Nephilim factors, it deals specifically with experience, saying that, like most role-playing games, you're going to be getting experience points to advance your character's capabilities, but also you're going to be advancing using the metamorphosis rules, which will actually change the physical form of your character, so be prepared for that. That was actually one of the stumbling blocks I had getting people interested in playing the game back in 1994 or 95. Partly because of bleed through from the art. The art in the book itself is fantastic, I feel. But when we get into the character art, less so. And, that can inform play decisions. So I don't want to look like that. Silly stuff. But they want to look like the vampires that Tim Bradstreet was doing. Anyway. So, recent conversations we've had about the Game Master are addressed in the box text on page 8. To play the game, a second task must be undertaken by one player, that of the Game Master. So, in these days, the Game Master was seen as a specialized player, much like they are now. But the position of authority is not present in this description, right? It doesn't talk about it. It's the Game Master's game. It's the game, the Game Master must do these things to control the world. It talks about directing the flow of the game while the players control the actions of the characters. It's a duality, a give and take. The Game Master describes what's going on, where they are, and other details of the plot. The players choose actions for their characters, thus cooperating with her in creating the adventure. So reading these early descriptions of role-playing and how the relationship exists between Game Master and player, that this is actually, as Ron Edward notes in Circle of Hands, this is actually a false dichotomy. I think clearly informed me when I was really starting to think about what we were doing and not just playing. So your experience will, of course, vary coming from different backgrounds. But let's get into what we're actually talking about. The unique Nephilim factors, there's these standard role-playing stuff for making a character in BRP and its variants. The unique factors for Nephilim are Ka and metamorphosis. The Nephilim is going to change shape, and this metamorphosis is going to be characterized by 5 physical transformations, and they're measured on a scale of 0 to 20, 20 being complete transformation. That's kind of interesting. It specifies very clearly that the metamorphoses are essential to role-playing in Nephilim. They characterize each Nephilim to act in agreement with its element. Now, the 5 elements, the Ka that we're talking about. All right. Then magic. We'll save the discussion of magic for later. So the history of the Nephilim. Throughout the book, there are quotes from real and imagined sources. So we've got the secret books of the Inquest of Herodotus, quoted on the first page of the history of the Nephilim. I have at last found proof of the existence of civilizations more ancient than us Hellenes, Atlantis of the Egyptian priests, the continent Mu of the poets. What new riches to discover, to visit, to tell. So that's kind of cool. And this is our introduction into the real history of the world. This is the 90s. This work is built on previous works such as Holy Blood and Holy Grail, which would later be pretty much ripped off wholesale by Dan Brown for his works. Holy Blood, Holy Grail, its original title, The Holy Blood and The Holy Grail, by Bajent, Lee, and Lincoln, brings together or synthesizes all the great conspiracies connected to the Masons regarding the true heritage of Christ. Did he die on the cross or not? And how all the conspiracies of the world are somehow linked to that, and of course controlling Christ's progeny. And which was treated a lot more respectfully by Umberto Eco in Foucault's Pendulum, this idea of these ongoing conspiracies. But those works, of course, look at human conspiracies. Nephilim takes things one level further because, it's the 90s and we're special. So the triggers here are that the characters are capable of great power. They're currently, due to circumstances beyond their control, not powerful, but they've got this potential inside them. Nobody understands who they really are. They've secretly been among us from the dawn of time we came. But they're also persecuted. There are small bands, these human secret societies, who may know that they're out there, who may want to take advantage of them, steal their secrets, kill them, whatever. Some groups, of course, may want to aid them. So among the first great secrets that a Nephilim learns is that history, as conceived by the majority of humans, is incorrect. Now, the word I felt coming was a lie. It's kind of nice that they just went incorrect. And like an initiation into a secret society, this opening piece of discourse serves to shock you, rock you back on your heels. Everything you know is a lie. Darwin is a lie. He was actually a member of an occult society, and he presented his findings as misdirection. He had actually learned of the true origin of humanity and other species from Atlantean documents, and yada, yada, yada. So, much like an occult initiation, the history of the Nephilim chapter opens. And then we're given this very subtle blending of game speak in with in-game fiction. So this version, it goes on to say, was translated into English in 1994 by Francis Hades, based on a draft by the Duke of Saint-Armand. He copied it from an anonymous scribed French parchment dated to the 17th century, and that one claims to have been a translation from the original, which was written in Enochian during the 2nd century AD by Simeon Bar Yochai, the master of Kabbalah. It is untitled, but like Babylonian manuscripts, has been given a title made up of its opening lines. So, here is that ancient Babylonian document, which we present to you as Before All. Right? And then, so all of this is supposed to be true. The opening pages are saying all of the information about the Nephilim is true. We got it from the documents of the Duke of Saint Armand. And then there's a forward saying, I heartily approve and condone of this work, and much like you would find in any real book. Now, a sad testament to the 90s and earlier, of course, is the need, because it deals with occult themes, is the need. No, I'm not going to be able to show this. There it is. This game is not real, it says. And then you turn the page, and it says, can you see that? You are. Which is cool, but also harkens back to the scares of the 80s. There isn't, really a note here about Nephilim discusses occult themes, but, don't try this at home, kids, kind of thing. But in a sense, in the 90s, this was a slightly dangerous feeling game, but also not. Pretty sanitized. Except for the sections on early Christianity and dealing with Christ, but we're not there yet. So, before all, which details truly before all, then gets us to the cycle of Mu, and then the life cycle of the Nephilim, which walks us to Atlantis, and then some unfortunate circumstances which set up how the game actually works. Now, it's not something that they can actually maintain at a highly detailed level throughout the whole book, but the author's familiarity with occult information is relevant. The quote on the back of the book from the Wiccan high priest made me laugh back in the 90s, but it doesn't invalidate it. You can definitely feel the awareness of all the typical occult conspiracy theories and all those little oddities, like the Nephilim themselves, the little tidbits down from prehistory. So the Before All chapter is a great example of how they did it. At the very end of the intro to the history of the Nephilim section on page 11, it describes the pedigree of this document. It describes the history of where this information comes from. It says that the version was first translated into English in 1994 by Francis Hades, based on a draft by the Duke of Saint Armand, who copied it from an anonymous French parchment dated to the 17th century, which itself claimed to have been a translation from the original, which was written in Enochian during the 2nd century AD by Simeon Bar Yochai, the master of Kabbalah. It's untitled, but is called Before All because the practice with dealing with these Babylonian manuscripts is to make a title based on their opening lines. And so we give you the true history of the world, which is known to all Nephilim. And that kind of establishing of providence from the chain of evidence down through the history is what makes occult works like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, like what Echo does in Foucault's Pendulum, makes these games so compelling, or at least makes the idea of the game compelling. So, Before All details a creation myth. Chaos and the force of the universe took shape, which we call the ether. And the ether concentrated itself to form the guides of our spirits, the stars. In our local system, the ethers became a sacred spot, the axis of the world, and formed the guide of our heart, the sun. So it's very poetic. So we have a formation of the universe into 5 planets, which it says using the Latin names, which is nice: Mercury, Venus, Luna, Mars, and Jupiter. And then those planets interacting with the ether, they formed a focal point to focus the ethers of the sun like a prism on a second magical point, and those mingled there and eventually formed the seventh celestial body of the universe, the Earth. So there's the sun, the focal point of all. There's these 5 planets, and then the conjunction of all of those things creates the Earth. And for a long time, nothing happened. But then the center of the Earth, which they refer to as the Grail, formed, and it was able to capture and hold these interacting energies. It was a container of all the physical forces. And 5 fields were created as a result of the Grail's effect on this interplay. We have the field of water, which is influenced by the planet Venus, the field of earth, which is influenced by Jupiter, the field of air, governed by Mercury, field of fire, governed by Mars, and the last was the field of the moon, which was dependent on the moon, Luna. The last field was the most powerful because of the proximity of the moon to Earth, they say. And by its nature, the moon was opposed to the force of the sun, and the interaction between these two things caused life to be born on Earth. And the life it caused to be born was the Saurians, whom we think of as the dinosaurs. But here's one of the first twists that they insert. The dinosaurs were intelligent and were basically sorcerer kings of the early world. And their leader, named Mu, was this wise and powerful tyrannosaur. Interesting image. They dedicated themselves to worship of the moon, the Saurians did, and they terraformed. They, much like a Greek society, they debated and so on. They waged wars for entertainment. They were not omniscient, it says. And while this is all going on, life is still being created on Earth, and the Nephilim appear, but they are not truly conscious yet. Now, the Saurians develop into a high race, basically. They're led by the prophet king Mu, and they decide that they will create a new celestial body, and they succeed. They create the Black Moon, and it emitted a stronger magical field than the moon, and intensified their powers and their pleasures even more. But this disharmony that this Black Moon creates in the natural balance of things, the natural order of things, are brought to consciousness, and they are, because they are without form, they are born of the 5 magical fields. They achieve consciousness and begin to oppose the Saurians. First, they recognize the threat of the Black Moon. They are the masters of the fields. They destroy the Black Moon. They inadvertently, or perhaps advertently, cause the extinction of the Saurians. But the destruction of the Black Moon destabilizes the lunar field, pollutes it for centuries, and the Nephilim are left with just 4 fields to master, but they continue to mature. That is before all, and that is the cycle of Mu, which brings us into the life cycle of the Nephilim. So, they are not born physically or chemically. They are brought forth spiritually. But they've learned to make for themselves physical bodies shaped by the natural elements which they naturally lean toward of the 4 fields that remain. So they started working towards unity and sophistication. They were refining their use of magic. They developed their own language, and so on. The life cycle of the Nephilim is described in great detail, and we'll get to that later on, I think, rather than taking more time in this ever-lengthening clip. More important, I think, is to talk about Atlantis. The section on Atlantis is basically detailing the point in the history of these beings where they repeat the mistakes of the people who came before them. So they've just finished this horrible war with the Saurians, who are doing terrible things, and well, now they're going to do it themselves. The Nephilim are brought into being by alignments of these 5 forces, however weak the 5th force, the lunar force, might be. And based on the point in time will determine which of the fields is dominant. Do they lean more toward fire than water, for example? And that will determine what physical form they have when they materialize. If they choose to materialize, they can then go through a process of trying to re-attain this higher consciousness or higher awareness as they transcend from the material world. So they can choose to incorporate, learn, grow, and then escape from that physical cycle. Maybe escape's the wrong word, but evolve out of that physical cycle as a higher element. But no one's succeeding. And they recognize that what they're lacking is access to the solar energy. None of them are built, formed with it in them, this other form of mystical potency and energy, enlightenment. So they form this society called the Golden Path, and they begin looking for a way, a form, a method, a way to attain this higher consciousness, which they're now calling Agartha. So they prepare a continent, which we will come to know as Atlantis after it's destroyed, and they prepare suitable vessels to try to merge with, and these, of course, become the early ancestors of humanity. But they're not conscious, and there's no way to bring this melding about. They're touched by the solar energy that the Ka'im, right, the early Nephilim, before they're called Nephilim, need, but there's no way to meld with them. And so a Promethean or trickster spirit figure tries a completely different tack and reveals himself to the creatures, explains everything, and this act causes consciousness to arise, humanity to be born, and this fragments the Golden Path, ultimately, as some come to bond with their human servants. Some completely set them free, and of course humans revolted, recognizing that they're slaves, and on and on and on. And so the seed both of their salvation and destruction are planted in this act, because the ones who escape slavery and flee from Atlantis carry with them all this secret knowledge, which then over time grows into these human secret societies. But then things get even worse. The planet that we haven't known about or talked about, Saturn, from its area of influence, from its field of energy, comes plummeting this giant meteorite which destroys Atlantis and brings with it this terrible metal which channels this destructive field, and it's called orichalca. And this can be used to slay the Nephilim, and this, of course, falls into human hands, empowering these secret societies from their former enslavers. The Nephilim were so weakened that they lost their non-physical or incorporeal bodies and were forced into physical bodies there to remain. And they viewed these diminished creatures as pitiful and changed their name to the Nephilim. That's the cycle of Atlantis. The next stage described is the creation of the Selenium, which is basically, after a great period of purging, the humans fighting back against their former masters, some grew so desperate that they were seeking, some of the Nephilim grew so desperate that they were seeking any means to defend themselves, and they learned that the fragments of the destroyed Black Moon could empower them, but would also change them. They became able to defend themselves against orichalca, but they lost their ties to everything that made a Nephilim, and they became the precursors in all of humans' myths of the things that go bump in the night. They became monsters, but they did manage to save the Nephilim and rose to a certain amount of ascendancy. And we're still in the vast prehistory of humanity. We're before Gilgamesh. And of course, things cannot remain this way. The Nephilim begin to hide secrets from each other, making their own secret societies, and even some of them even come to oppose their saviors, the Selenium. Some humans chose to worship individual or groups of Nephilim as benevolent, more or less, gods. And this brings us down into Egypt. With all of the cooperation that arose from these groups of Nephilim working together in harmony and against outside forces, this drives development, and they learn to solve one of their primary problems, that when their physical form is destroyed, as has been happening, they lose everything that they were. Now, while there's a chance that they might be born again in a process that they don't understand, they'd be born again without the benefit of their memory or experience. It's like they're literally born again, and a new version of them is brought forward, lacking any of the previous version's experience. But they learn a way to beat this. They can anchor themselves to these physical objects, which they call stasis, or the process is going into stasis. But, of course, their human priests and priestesses and whatnot learn about these vessels and how they're used to reincarnate in human bodies, or are so very important to the Nephilim. So they learn how to hide them in specific places so that they're isolated from the energies which give the Nephilim power. So when the Nephilim is forced into the object, they'll never appear again. So we've got all these standing stones. So things like Stonehenge, the Great Pyramids, and whatnot might be places where the Nephilim are hidden and essentially trapped for all time. So that's nice. Then brings us to the Great Compromise. As you might imagine, the Great Compromise is, well, the final building of an interactive religion where there's a trade going on. Allow me to inhabit you, O priest, and make my way to Agartha through that interaction, and you will be rewarded. And so, of course, we have this long-lived pact, which brings about the rise of Egyptian civilization. And that's basically it. The compromise lasted without fail for 2,000 years, until the incarnation of the Nephilim Akhenaten, some 1,350 years before the coming of Jesus Christ. And that ends the translation of the Before All Babylonian document. But this chapter doesn't end here. It ends with the end of the compromise. We have another quote: "Humans, you who think we mad, take heed, for a time will come when the Nephilim will all wake up en masse and will take possession of your bodies." The destiny of the Nephilim. For thousands of years, the Nephilim have materialized, lived, and faded again. At times they have come in groups, and in times of great crisis, they have come by the hundreds. How many this time? What part will you play in the fate of the world this time? What purpose will you serve this time as you struggle to gain Agartha? So, a good premise, good setting, lots of rich hooks. You'll be given the opportunity to take on the form of an elf or a sylph or a satyr or a salamander or something tied to an element in some way. You will have opposition drawn from your own kind, from humans who are aware, from humans who are unaware, and from these mysterious Selenium, should they still exist out there somewhere. This is the world of Nephilim, where you are tied both to a vast and much greater conspiracy, but dealing with a human scale conspiracy and the vagaries of memory, the desire to evolve, the need to stay secret. This is Nephilim Occult Role-Playing. This is a first look inside, basically, Chapter 1 for the RPG Game Learning Group.